We are still in our introduction time. If you have your syllabus there, you see that this evening we're going to begin dealing with chapter 7, the historical setting. We are going to get to the actual Gospel of John before much longer, but it's helpful to have this introduction so we'll know how to understand what we're going to understand. We have on our ceiling in the sanctuary several icons depicting scenes out of the life of Saint Elijah, who is our patron saint. And one of those scenes is the scene where he has the showdown on Mount Carmel with the false prophets of Baal, where they're going to have the altar built, and whichever God answers by fire would prove to be the true God. And so they're going to call down fire from heaven. And the false gods, of course, were unable to do so. And Elijah did pray, and the fire fell. And it is an icon showing the fire falling from heaven. And you can almost feel the heat and the sound of that whoosh when that fire would hit that altar and it curls outward as it's depicted there. That's the end of the story. What's not depicted would be what led up to that moment when the fire fell, and that is it had not rained in a long time and everything was very dry. And St. Elijah did not want there to be any hint of trickery, that when the fire fell it might have been because he was having a spark over here with his Zippo lighter or something. So they labored and built this altar. They put the wood on it, and then they dug a trench all the way around the four sides of the altar, a deep kind of ditch, and they hauled barrels of water to that altar, and they poured it over the top of all of the wood and drenched it, and drenched it, and drenched it until the wood was totally soaked, and the ditch around the altar actually had water standing in it. It would soak into the ground because it was dry. They kept pouring the water till it had water standing. That's how much water was put there. It was then and only then, after all that work had been done, that Elijah is going to pray for God to now hear his prayer and to send that fire from heaven to ignite this wet wood with the sacrifice on it. I am saying all of this to let you know that there are times in our lives and times in a course like this when it's time to do the hard work of carrying the wood, building the altar, and we do so knowing that God will answer and the fire will fall. I'm saying that as an introduction to talking about history. Most people do not like history at all. The older we get, maybe we begin to like it just a little bit. And for some of us this evening is going to feel like all we did was carry dry, dusty logs and stack them in a pile. And I'm not exactly sure the fire fell or if it's ever going to fall on that pile of woods. The reason we're going to deal with a little history is this. If I were to say to you, and you know it would not be true, but I want you to understand this. If I were to say to you the Gospel of John was written in Germany during the Nazi era. If I were to tell you that, you would immediately have a whole picture of the context facing that parish, facing that church, and facing those believers. Because we know that history of the Nazis in our lifetime for most of us in this room. Some of us born after World War II would at least have heard about it. It's still recent history for us. The Gospel of John is not recent history. It's 2,000 years old. The living circumstances that John was in and his parish was in is totally lost to us and invisible to us. Now, when I say lost, I mean we don't know it. It's findable, but we don't know it the way we do if I said this happened in Nazi Germany. And so what we're going to begin doing this evening is begin introducing us to John's world. And not just his world, but he had a congregation, he had a parish, and he wrote this for his parish, and he wrote it for the other parishes in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. So he wrote it for us. He had a Mystagogic class, and here we are 2,000 years later, gathered as his Mystagogic class. Only some of what's happening and what he's talking about is invisible to us simply because we're not 2,000 years ago. So I'm going to this evening begin to paint a little bit of that background so that when we get to John in a couple of weeks, we'll know a little bit more of where we are and what's going on. Now, I don't expect you to remember anything I say tonight. There's absolutely no exams. You like that one, didn't you? Okay. There are no exams. You don't have to remember any dates. I'm going to give you some dates only because if we had a board up here and we could draw a line on it, it would be a timeline. And we would just put a date on it to let you know where we are in relationship to something else. For example, if we decided to get on a bus, all of us, and we wanted to go to Dallas. And we were playing around, talking with one another on the bus, not paying any attention. And we leave Oklahoma City, and at some point one of us looks up and it says, Ponca City, 10 miles ahead. We would all know we headed the wrong way because we know the location on I-35 from Oklahoma City, and Ponca City takes us north to Wichita, not south to Dallas. Now, if we see something that says Norman, Purcell, Pauls Valley, Marietta, Gainesville, we're relaxed and we go back to whatever it was we were doing. We know where we are on the road, even if we don't know the mileage or the marker. We know where we are on the road. That's all these dates are for. So don't get worried about them. We just have to get a little bit of information. Don't worry about remembering it, because we're going to bump into it again and again at different points in where we're headed over the next weeks together. But you will know where you could look back in chapter 7. Oh yeah, what was that? And on your own, you can flip back to here to locate what we talked about. So this is your reference point. This is your roadmap that is yours then to every now and then go, oh yeah. And if maybe I'll even have us turn back to something, or I'll say it's back there, you can put it in your notes. So that's where we start tonight, chapter 7. Are we good? Okay, let's do it then. Jesus was a Jew. To be more precise, Jesus was a Palestinian Jew living in the first 3 decades of the first century. Both those who followed him and those who rejected him were Palestinian Jews as well. 21 centuries later, it is difficult for Jews and non-Jews to comprehend the existential realities of Palestinian Judaism in the first century. Many, if not most, Christians today have always thought of Christianity and Judaism as two separate religions. They are often shocked to learn that Christianity was once Jewish. Rabbinic Judaism and Christian Judaism are twins, birthed from the same womb of the first century Palestinian Judaism. With the sibling relationship of Christianity and Judaism all but forgotten today, a Jewish rabbi recently reminded us that when we look at Jesus, this is written by a Jewish rabbi to us Christians, I guess, as well as to his Jewish people, we behold a man who is Jewish in every feature and trait of his character, manifesting in every particular what is pure and good in Judaism. This man, and it's capitalized M, this man could have developed as he came to be only on the soil of Judaism, and only on this soil also could he find his disciples and followers as they were. Here alone, in this Jewish sphere, in this Jewish atmosphere, could this man live his life and meet his death, a Jew among Jews. Since he was, no time has been without him. Wow. No time has been without that man since he was here on this earth. He is still here. We're still talking about him, and he is being talked about in congregations all across this world and has been for 2,000 years. Since he was, no time has been without him. The Jewish soil on which Jesus walked and lived is unknown to us 21 centuries later. But it was not unknown to Jesus and his contemporaries. The very first century air they breathed was Jewish air. When the Word became flesh, it was Jewish flesh he became. When he dwelt among us, it was in first century Palestine that he dwelt. Now there was a stench in that first century Palestinian air, the stench of Rome. Judea was an occupied territory within the Roman Empire. The role Rome played in the creation of Judea in the first century BC and the creation of the Herodian dynasty, and the role the Jewish temple tax played in defining who a Jew was after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD is often forgotten in discussing the struggle of Christianity within Judaism in the first century. Additionally, the Roman occupation of Judea provided the counterpoint that both created and tainted the many understandings of Israelite Heilgeschichte, the salvation history of their own story. Terms such as Kingdom of God, Son of Man, and Messiah were understood differently by the various factions within the Palestinian Jewish community of the first century. Into such a Jewish world filled with competing voices offering their own expectations of what God would do, no, what God must do according to them. It was into that world that the Word became flesh and dwelt. When Jesus spoke, his audience filtered what he said through the many expectations current in their Jewish world. John wrote the gospel 50 to 60 years after the resurrection of Jesus. The world had radically changed since the time of Jesus. Jerusalem and the temple had been destroyed by the time John wrote his gospel. The Romans had imposed a tax on Jews and pressured the Jews to define who a Jew was for tax purposes. The Romans forbade the Jews from making converts to Judaism. Christianity sought to exist within Judaism, but the conversion of Gentiles to Christianity was seen by the Romans as breaking the Roman requirement on the Jews not to make converts. Roman pressure on the Jews intensified. Tension between Jews and Gentiles openly evangelizing non-Jews intensified. You got tension between Jews and Christian Jews, and then these Christian Jews are making converts of Gentiles, and the Roman said you can't make converts, and boy, you've got tension beginning to happen. The debate inside of Judaism between Jews and Christian Jews over the identity and the divinity of Jesus intensified also. I'm telling you, this is a pot about to explode, and that's where Christianity was in its first 60 years, from AD 30 to AD 90 when John writes his gospel. With the resurrection in AD 30 and John writing his gospel, 60 years later, in that 60 years, the world that was there in 30 AD is now gone. It has totally been obliterated, and it's a brand new world with everybody scrambling to not get killed by Rome. And it is into that world that John is writing this gospel and giving mystagogic instruction to his class. So, let's just talk about a historical timeline as quickly as we can. I told you we're going to carry some lumber tonight. I'm sorry, I can't make this stuff any faster or easier than it is. Just listen to the story and get the idea we're moving down a road and we're starting back here and coming. The authors of the New Testament did not live, nor did they write in a vacuum. The documents of the New Testament were written between the resurrection of Jesus and the death of the Apostle John in 100 AD, within that 70-year period. During these 70 years, the church came into existence, but even these 70 years must be understood within the larger context of events within the Roman Empire. The history we are considering was shaped by three realities: Rome, the synagogue, and the church. These realities are often discussed as separate histories. We've all studied Rome or heard about Rome in our secular historical educations. We can have a church history class that's going to talk about the history of the church during this time. And we can understand or just read about the Jewish and what the Jews did after the destruction of the temple and all of the events happening. Very seldom do we consider all three simultaneously and how they interacted with each other and how what was happening with one was causing something to happen with the others. However, it is this interplay between each of the three that created and shaped a common history. A common history that ultimately resulted in the Christianization of the Roman Empire under Constantine. The following chronological outline, however briefly, provides a sequential look at some of the key events impacting the church and the synagogue within the Roman Empire. So I can draw a line. I'm not going to try to put anything on it, and that marker wouldn't be visible if I did. So there we are, a little better. It's just a line. This is our roadmap. We're going to start back here at this moment in 63 BC. How's that? Okay. When Herod the Great was 10 years old, Herod the Great, the opening verses of Matthew chapter 2, 1 through 23, the whole chapter is about Herod being king and what he's going to do when the Magi come looking for the one that has been born the King of the Jews, Herod. The Herod you bump into in Matthew chapter 2, we're going to start here to tell you a little bit how he comes into play so we'll know who Herod is and what's going on. Or you could open with Luke chapter 1, verse 5, where Herod again is mentioned. Herod didn't just drop down out of the sky. When Herod, he was known among the Jews as Herod the Great, when Herod the Great was 10 years old, the Roman general Pompey invaded Palestine, conquered Palestine. Herod's father, Antipater, became an ally, and the association between the Herodians and Rome began. They became such an association between Herod ruling Palestine and Rome ruling Rome from Rome that the Herods would go spend summer vacation with the Caesars. There is a close relationship after 63 BC between the king of the Jews, Herod, and Caesar, Julius Caesar in Rome, a relationship. The Jewish historian Josephus records the relationship of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Octavian, that's Caesar Augustus, we read about in the Gospel of Luke, in his Antiquities of the Jew, as the citations which follow will show. Now, I've actually quoted, just so you know it's here, you can see the historical evidence yourself, what Josephus is going to say. I really don't want to read all of it, but I want to skim some of it with you, just so you can actually get a feel that we're talking about real people that you've heard of. However, when Caesar, this is Josephus telling his story, however, when Caesar, after some time, had finished that war, this is Julius Caesar, and was sailed away from Syria, he honored Antipater greatly and confirmed Hyrcanus in the high priesthood and bestowed on Antipater the privilege of a citizen of Rome. Julius Caesar made Antipater head of the Jews and granted him citizenship as a Roman citizen and made him free, let all the Jews be free from paying Roman taxes everywhere in the Roman Empire. That's a pretty important relationship from Julius Caesar. When Antipater had made this speech, Caesar appointed so-and-so the high priest and gave Antipater what principality he himself should choose, leaving the determined, Antipater, what do you want to be ruler of? And he said, I want Judea. He became the ruler of Judea because Caesar gave him his pick, and that's what he picked. Antipater then named his two sons, Phasaelus or whatever it is, and Herod as governors to rule with him. That's all there. I'm not going to read Josephus. It's there. But I will look at 41 BC. Mark Antony, we've all heard about him, and who? Cleopatra. You mean to tell me that's going to become part of our story? Wow. Mark Antony makes Herod a tetrarch, a ruler. When after this Antony came into Syria, Cleopatra met him in Cilicia and brought him to fall in love with her. And there came now also 100 of the most potent, powerful of the Jews to accuse Herod and those about him, and set the men of the greatest eloquence among them to speak. They're all bringing all these people. They don't want Herod to be their ruler anymore, and they're bad-mouthing him to Mark Antony. But Messala contradicted them, and on behalf of the young men, and all this in the presence, who was Herod's father-in-law already, when Antony had heard both sides at Daphne. So the Roman Senate has officially, it's no longer just Antony that did this or Julius Caesar that's done this. He's now had it ratified by the Roman Senate that Herod is the king of the Jews in 37. In the 7th year of Herod's reign, a civil war is going to break out between Antony and Octavian. At this time, it was that the fight happened at Actium between Octavius Caesar and Antony in the 7th year of the reign of Herod. Herod, because of his long association with Antony, backed Antony in his war against Octavian. Now, if you've got any memory of history at all, you're going to go right now, uh-oh, because you know who wins. Octavian won. He's backed the wrong guy. He's backing Antony, and the other guy wins. A defeated Antony returns to Egypt and will commit suicide with Cleopatra. Herod's other affairs, this is Josephus, were now very prosperous, and he was not to be easily assaulted on any side. He's pretty secure. Yet did there come upon him a danger that would hazard his entire dominions after Antony had been beaten at the battle of Actium by Caesar. For at that time both Herod's enemies and friends despaired of his affairs. For it was not probable that he would remain without punishment, who had shown so much friendship for Antony. The guy's in trouble. He can be killed easily. Herod immediately sought out Caesar, Octavian, confessed his long-standing friendship and service to Antony, confessed his dealings with Antony had always been open, honest, and without deceit. He also confessed that none of his soldiers had fought against Antony against Caesar. Herod then pledged the same kind of loyalty and friendship without deceit to Octavian Caesar. Octavian was impressed by Herod's frankness and restored him his diadem, his crown, and encouraged him to exhibit himself as a great friend to himself, a great friend to the new Caesar, Augustus, as he had been to Antony, and then he held him in great esteem. Wow. You've had Julius Caesar, then you've got Mark Antony, and now you've got Caesar Augustus all backing this guy named Herod, and Herod has got the Romans to say, we'll never tax the Jews. So the Jews are happy with him because he's kept them from having to pay taxes to the Romans. This is a fairly nice arrangement, don't you think? This is a cozy relationship between the ruler of the Jews and the ruler of the Roman Empire. It's an invisible relationship to us, but boy, the Jews had it pretty good because they had a good relationship with Caesar through Herod. Then we come to 20 BC. Herod begins building the temple in Jerusalem. The first temple had been built by Solomon. King David had got the material together. Solomon, his son, is going to build the temple. That's known as the first temple. Later on in Jewish history, they were conquered by the Babylonians, and that temple fell into ruin. And after 70 years in Babylonian captivity, a remnant of the Jews came back to Palestine and began to rebuild the city, and they built just almost like a temporary structure. It was nothing as like Solomon's temple. It was the best they could do. They were pretty poor and they didn't have much building materials. Herod, in 20 BC, is going to have that temple taken down and is going to enlarge the Temple Mount, which was kind of a small hill. He's going to have a big wall built here and a big wall, and they're going to fill in the dirt so that suddenly you've got this huge flat area on top that used to be a little hill here, but now with these walls out here up and fill it all in, you've got a massive Temple Mount now to build a massive, huge temple on. And he is going to begin building that temple in 20 BC. This is the temple that Jesus will look at in the Gospel of John and say, you tear that down and in 3 days I will build it back up. This is the temple we're talking about that began to be built in 20 BC by this King Herod, friend of the Roman Caesars. And now Herod, in the 18th year of his reign, and after the acts already mentioned, undertook a very great work, that is, to build of himself the temple of God, and make it larger in compass, and to raise it to a most magnificent altitude, as esteeming it to be the most glorious of all his actions, as it really was, to bring it to perfection, and this would be sufficient for an everlasting memorial to himself. Then we come to 14 BC. I'm trying to go as quickly as we can. We're just moving down the road, bumping into stuff we're all going to bump into in John or in the other Gospels. In 14 BC, Caesar Augustus wrote a letter to the citizens of Cyrene forbidding the mistreatment of Jews, including forbidding interference with the sending of sacred money by the Jews to Jerusalem for the support of Herod's new temple. Aha! The Romans were not taxing the Jews, but now Herod gets to tax the Jews throughout the entire Roman Empire, and they are to send a Jewish tax to Jerusalem to help pay for this big, new, grandiose temple that is being built in Jerusalem. Caesar Augustus, high priest and tribune of the people, ordains thus: since the nation of the Jews have been found grateful to the Roman people, not only at this time, but in times past also, and under Hyrcanus the high priest, under my father Julius Caesar the emperor, it seems good to me and my counselors, according to the sentence and oath of the people of Rome, that the Jews have liberty to make their own customs according to the law of their forefathers, as they made use of them under Hyrcanus the high priest of Almighty God, and that their sacred money, that Jewish temple tax, be not touched, but be sent to Jerusalem, and that it be committed to the care of the receivers at Jerusalem, and that they be not obliged to go before any judge on the Sabbath day, nor on the day of preparation to it after the 9th hour. Jews could not, the Sabbath would be honored, and they could not be taken to court on the Sabbath day or on Friday after the 9th hour, because that began the Sabbath day for the Jews. It begins at sunset. That is privilege. Not only did they not pay the tax to the Romans, they are now guaranteed the freedom of the Sabbath day by Rome. Rome will not interfere with them on that day of their worship. And if anyone, non-Jew, is caught stealing their holy books or their sacred money, or whether it's out of the synagogue or one of their schools, he shall be deemed a sacrilegious person, and his goods shall be brought to the public treasury of the Romans. Anyone that was a non-Jew caught stealing anything from the Jews, everything he owned would be confiscated and given to the Roman treasury, and he'd be killed. You getting the picture of how cozy this deal is? This is incredible. The granting of religious freedom to the Jews began during the reign of Julius Caesar, In 47 BC until, and it should say 14 AD. I was dyslexic, I did them backwards. Continued from 47 until 14 AD. Their religious freedom included the collecting and sending a temple tax, sacred money, to Jerusalem for the support of the temple. Herod's temple, begun in 20 BC, was finally completed some 80 years later in 62 AD. It was still being built when Jesus was at the temple and said, "You guys tear this down and I'll rebuild it." It wasn't even finished then. That's how big it was and grandiose it was. Within 8 years of being finished in 62, it will be destroyed by the Roman army. Wow. Just that little piece of information lets us know something has happened to sour this cozy relationship that the Jews had with Caesar. The temple finally gets built in 62 AD, and in 80 AD, the Roman army is going to destroy that temple and is going to level Jerusalem. Something's going on, and there's tension beginning to happen now between the Jews and the Romans. And 60 AD, 62, 70, that's Christ was crucified in 30. We're right in the middle of this. Our story is birthed and happening somehow in the good times of a relationship with the Romans, and now it's all being blown apart, and here we are being the church. This stuff is affecting us in our daily lives and in our religious lives. The history of the world changed in the 183 years between Julius Caesar granting religious freedom to the Jews in 47 BC and the Third Jewish-Roman War in 136 AD. The Jewish temple became the center of national religious life for Palestinian Jews and the focal point of Hellenized Jews scattered across the Roman Empire, Mesopotamia, and Persia. Synagogues across the world collected an annual temple tax that was sent to the treasurer of the Jerusalem temple. The Jewish scriptures had been translated into Greek after Alexander the Great established Alexandria in Egypt in the 3rd century BC. By 90 AD, again within the time John is writing his gospel, Jewish nationalism and 2 Jewish-Roman wars had destroyed Judea. The Romans totally destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, depopulated Palestine, and diverted the temple tax as a tax now imposed on all Jews and sent to Caesar in Rome. The Jews rejected Hellenistic Judaism, abandoned the Greek translation of their own scriptures, and began their full retreat into their ethnic ghettos. A little-known Messianic sect with a crucified leader gained a name, emerged out of Judaism, and then was persecuted by the Romans as an illicit religion. That's us. The identities of 3 entities, the church, the synagogue, and imperial Rome, clashed as their separate identities, goals, and purposes competed. The relationship of church, synagogue, and imperial Rome to each other was fluid and changed due to new developments with any of or all 3 of them. It is impossible to understand correctly the relationship of the church and the synagogue during these years without first understanding the relationship of the synagogue and imperial Rome that began with Julius Caesar when he granted them their religious freedom. We got to know what happened between Caesar and the Jews that's going to blow that apart and is then going to create the turmoil inside for Christianity. I just talked about the Roman side of this. Now let me talk about the synagogue side of mine. I'm going the best I can, guys. I know it's the fire will fall later. The good stuff is going to come. Okay, the synagogue. The defining moment in Israelite Jewish history. Now we're going to start with them for just a second, real fast. The defining moment of Israelite history was the Exodus from Egypt in 1500 BC. Under the leadership of Moses in the Exodus forever defined the Israelites in terms of deliverance by a deliverer. The Israelites established a loose tribal confederation after their entry and conquest of Palestine. The period of that tribal confederation was characterized by a series of dominance by indigenous peoples. They were conquered by the people that lived there, from which deliverance was given to the Israelites by a deliverer known as a judge. That tribal confederation ended with the creation of the first Jewish monarchy in 1050 BC. Saul was the first king of Israel, was consecrated by the act of pouring oil on his head. The relationship of oil and the application of the oil is seen in terms ointment and anointed in English. It's one of the few places the connection is still visible. Ointment is oil, and anointed is to have been anointed with oil. The kings of Israel were anointed with oil, and thereafter the king was the anointed one of Israel, or simply the anointed. David succeeded the first king Saul, who died in battle. With David, a new element modified the Israelite identity. It's called the Davidic covenant, a covenant between God and David, in which the Israelite God guaranteed the survival of David's throne, upon which his descendants would reign forever. With David, the concept of a deliverer was now institutionalized. The king would perpetually be the deliverer of the people. Fast forward, the Babylonians conquered Judah and brought an end to the Davidic kingdom in 586. The majority of the people are taken captive to Babylon, where they will live in exile. I'm going to skip everything over to the paragraph that says the Deuteronomist historians focus the attention of the exiles on repentance in expectation of deliverance by a deliverer. Here they are in exile. If we will pray and repent, God will send a deliverer and deliver us from this exile. But the concept of a deliverer was now modified by the Davidic covenant and the concept of an anointed king. In Hebrew, the term anointed is Mashiach. I don't speak Greek and I don't speak Hebrew. I'm doing the best I can. From it we get the English word Messiah. In 516 BC, deliverance came when the Persians conquered Babylon and permitted the exiled Israelites to return to Palestine. It was not a descendant of David, but the Persian king Cyrus that God called his Mashiach, anointed in Isaiah 45:1. In Hebrew, Isaiah 45:1 literally says, Thus says the Lord God to Cyrus, my Messiah, whose right hand I hold. In Greek, Isaiah 41 literally says, thus says the Lord God to Cyrus, my Christ, whose right hand I hold. In the person of Cyrus, therefore, the concept of a deliverer and a Mashiach, an anointed one, a Messiah, a Christ, merged. In the popular mind, the deliverer would be a descendant of David and would re-establish the throne of his father David. These are all themes you bump into in the Gospels. The deliverer, therefore, would become their king, their anointed one, their Mashiach. In English, Mashiach became Messiah. Israelite history technically ended when the Babylonian exile began in 586 BC, and Jewish history began when the Babylonian exile ended in 516 BC. The tribe of Judah was the only tribe left that came back to Judea. In addition to, and you need to scratch through the word Exodus, that's incorrect. In addition to the nucleus of what would become the Jewish scriptures, exiles returning to Palestine brought with them the emerging ideas of deliverer, son of David, and Mashiach, Messiah. This is how it entered into the thinking of the Jewish people 500 years before Christ. Then a political Messiah, Mashiach. The most obvious understanding of the Mashiach was as a political leader of an earthly kingdom. He will be the very real king of a very real Torah government. Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament of the legal system. Torah government in the land of Israel. In the imagination of the people, the Mashiach embodied the hopes and dreams of having the perfect political leader. The Messiah will be a great political leader descended by a pure male line from King David. The Mashiach is often referred to as Mashiach ben David. This is from the Jewish sources, by the way. We need to know what they tell us about their history. And so this is from their information. He is called the Mashiach ben David, the son of David, the Messiah of David. He will be well versed in Jewish law and observant in its commandments. He will be a charismatic leader, inspiring others to follow his example. He will be a great military figure who will win battles for Israel, freeing the Jews from foreign domination and establishing a Torah-based kingdom in Israel. He will be a great judge who makes righteous decisions, but above all, according to the Jewish sources, he will be a fully normal human being, not a god, demigod, or other supernatural being. We're getting the basic understanding of what a Messiah is to the Jews out of their long history. So you've got the idea of an anointed one. Now we've got the idea of a political one. And now we introduce a third concept. Get ready for a long word. An eschatological Messiah. I know you're going, what now? The Greek term eschaton is often used to speak about the last things. And I have a feeling if I don't stop right now and give you a break, it's going to be the last. I can see that glazed look beginning to come. So let's take a break. There's some coffee, I think, some water. Stretch around. Shake off your weary bones from carrying these heavy logs. And we'll come back in about 10 minutes. Thank you. Well, thank you for coming back. What we are doing, yes ma'am?
One ticket will get the whole family in.
One ticket gets a family in, so you only need one ticket. That means we got enough tickets for everybody, I think. So, all right, that's great. Thank you. we're going to bump into, as you know, in the New Testament story, these terms: Son of David, Son of Man. We're going to, in Messiah, which becomes Christ. We're going to go through all of that stuff. But they are originally Jewish terms. We are looking at their creation inside of Judaism that has a 300, 400, 500 year, 1,000-year history of usage before the Word becomes flesh and dwells among them. And so what they mean by Messiah and what the church means by Messiah are not necessarily, and obviously not necessarily, the same thing. We're always wondering, well, those stupid people, why didn't they convert? I'm trying to get you to see this is a human story. The people who didn't convert then are no different than the people who don't convert now. It's because of the culture, the background, the history, the use of the terms. If we're going to... I'm losing everything. I got it. If we're going to understand the miracle of the incarnation, the resurrection, not only as in 30 AD, but the living presence of God in His church in 90 AD and in 2000 AD, we have to have the human side of the story. We just want a sanitized little Sunday school version. And the mystery never opens. We have to pay the price to build the altar so the fire can fall. I am going to help a little bit. I know some of us have told me at halftime, hey, I love this. But I can see it on your faces. So I can skip a few pages and just tell you what it is in one or two words to make it easier, so you don't have a wreck on your way home tonight because of that headache. So, we stopped at eschatological Messiah. The end time, end of the world, day of the Lord, one who ushers in the coming of the kingdom of God for eternity. Eschatological. If I put my hand right there and I fast forward over to 41 AD, I have just skipped the beginning of Christian history, which maybe you could read on your own. Can you find 41 AD?
78. Yes, 78.
Page 78. Now, if you will just flip backwards, not a flip bodily backwards, but just go backwards just a couple of pages. See if you find a paragraph that says by 40 AD, the first Gentile church.
Yes, bottom of 76.
The bottom of page 76. Let us begin right there. Somebody was praying, Lord have mercy, during the break, and I just gave you some, so okay. By 40 AD, the first Gentile church had been established in Antioch. Believers were first called Christians in Antioch. Both Peter and Paul played a role in Antioch. The first missionary journeys originated in Antioch. St. John Chrysostom was born there. St. Ignatius was the second bishop there. Pretty important place is all I'm making of it. Upon learning of the conversion of Gentiles in Antioch, the church in Jerusalem, as they had done previously with the conversion of Samaria, took an active role in overseeing this new church. they sent Barnabas to Antioch. After assisting in the growth of the church in Antioch, Barnabas went to Tarsus, found Paul, and brought him back to Antioch to assist in the work of the church. Barnabas and Paul actively catechized the church for a year. We still catechize our inquirers for about a year. The church has always done it this way. 2,000 years later, we still do it this way. It was at this point that the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. The resurrection of Jesus Christ caused his followers to think outside the parochial box of Judaism. Christianity was viewed as a novel sect by mainstream Judaism, a novel sect that exacerbated the inherent tension already existing between Palestinian Jews and Hellenistic Jews. All of the stuff we just skipped, I'm just summarizing. The acceptance of Gentiles into the church, Gentiles, non-Jews, further increased the tension within Judaism. As long as the church was seen as a sect within Judaism by the Jews and the Romans, issues of Gentiles becoming Christians was seen by the Romans as Gentiles becoming Jews. It was the Romans who ultimately objected to Gentiles becoming Jews. Bingo. 40 AD, Antioch, on the move. Now I'm going to tell you about 41 AD in Alexandria. Alexandria is a Greek city on the north end of Egypt. We see it as an Egyptian city today, but it was a Greek city, and Egypt would have been south of it towards the equator. Imperial Rome and the synagogue, 41 AD. While we're busy in Antioch, this is happening in Alexandria, which, by the way, has had a huge congregation of Jews there who escaped from the Babylonians when the Babylonians attacked Palestine way back in 586 BC that I mentioned a while ago. They escaped, didn't go to Persia, to Babylon to be part of the exile. They moved there, and they've been living there and multiplying there and are now a huge Jewish population in Alexandria, 41 AD. Claudius, now the emperor, became the emperor of Rome and rules from 41 to 54 AD. These were crucial years in defining the relationship between Imperial Rome and the synagogue, and in defining the relationship between the synagogue and the church. In 41 AD, a riot broke out between the Greeks and the Jews living in Alexandria, Egypt. Both groups sent ambassadors to Rome to appeal to Claudius. In response, Claudius wrote a letter to the city of Alexandria that contained the following passage regarding the Jews. As for the question which party was responsible for the riots and feud, or rather, if the truth be told, the war with the Jews, although in confrontation with their opponents, your ambassadors, and particularly Dionysius, the son of Theon, contended with great zeal. Nevertheless, I was unwilling to make a strict inquiry. I really didn't want to know how it started. That's what he's saying. Though guarding within me a store of immutable indignation against whichever party renews the conflict. I really don't care who started it, but no one better start it up again. I do care who starts it again. And I tell you once and for all that unless you put a stop to this ruinous and obstinate enmity against each other, I shall be driven to show what a benevolent prince can be when turned to righteous indignation. Whoa! I don't want to ever get a letter like that. Wherefore, once again, I conjure you, on the one hand, the Alexandrians show themselves forbearing and kindly towards the Jews who for many years have dwelt in the same city, and dishonor none of the rites observed by them in the worship of their God, but allow them to observe their customs as in the time of the deified Augustus, which customs I also, after hearing both sides, have sanctioned. That's the stuff we read about earlier that started with Julius Caesar and then went to Antony and then went to Augustus. Having heard both sides have sanctioned, on the other hand, I explicitly order the Jews not to agitate for more privileges than they formerly possessed, and not in the future to send out a separate embassy as though they lived in a separate city, a thing unprecedented. They sent their own delegation as if they were their own people and city. And not to force their way into, I can't pronounce the word, the gymnasium or the cosmetic games. The gymnasium is where you didn't wear clothes to exercise. That would have been outrageous to the Jews, and the Jews are going to attack that or to attack the games like the Olympic Games because they competed without clothes. You can see the tension. They cannot force their way into the gyms or the games while enjoying their own privileges and sharing a great abundance of advantages in a city not their own, and not to bring in or admit Jews who come down the river from Egypt or from Syria. And you guys can't import other Jews to make your population bigger. A proceeding which will compel me to conceive serious suspicions that you're trying to take over the town by outgrowing and becoming the majority. Otherwise, I will by all means take vengeance on them as fomenters of which is a general plague infecting the whole world. I'm putting a stop to this nonsense now before I have this problem with you Jews all over my empire. And you non-Jews, I'm not putting up with it. He's making an example of the Jews and the Greeks in Alexandria. Got it? Okay. If, desisting from these courses, you consent to live with mutual forbearance and kindliness, I, on my side, will exercise a solicitude of very long standing for the city as one which is bound to us by traditional friendship. Now, we can kiss and make up and all be friends. Claudius affirmed the religious freedom of the Jews, but made this freedom contingent upon not creating a separate Jewish city, a ghetto, within the city of Alexandria, and to not enlarge the Jewish population in Alexandria by importing Jews from Egypt or Syria. Claudius also issued an empire-wide edict concerning the Jews based upon a prior edict by Caesar Augustus. So he sends this letter to Alexandria, and then he's going to issue an edict for the entire Roman Empire. You've got it quoted there. It will therefore be fit to permit the Jews who are in the entire world under us to keep their ancient customs without being hindered to do so. That's the stuff that they've already been authorized to do. And I do charge them also to use this my kindness to them with moderation, and not to show contempt of the superstitious observances of other nations. You can't make fun of somebody else's religion. They may be superstitious to you, they're not to them. Stop it. But to keep their own laws only. You Jews, mind your own business, keep your own laws, and let everybody else live by their religion, and you've got safety in the empire. Claudius made Jewish freedom of religion conditional. They could not create separate cities within cities in the Roman Empire. They could not migrate to a few cities and become a majority there. They could not protest public games and other activities sanctioned by Rome. They could not denigrate any other religion legally recognized within the empire. In other words, they could not use their freedom to practice their religion as a freedom to replace, supplant, or make converts from other religions within the empire. They could not proselytize. The Jews knew the threat of Roman power was no idle threat. Claudius reigned from 41 to 54. During his reign, he made good his threat for the Jews to live peaceably within the Roman Empire. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, since the Jews were continually making disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, Emperor Claudius expelled them from Rome. Mention was made of this expulsion in the book of Acts. A certain Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. He said, that's it. I'll give you to midnight to get out of town. And they left, leaving their goods, their property, their shops, their businesses. They escaped alive and got out of town. They got out of Dodge. It cost them. They escaped with their lives, but that's about it. They didn't have moving vans come in. They didn't give them 6 months. That's it, you're gone. It's mentioned in your Bible. We're setting the history so we know when these events are happening and what this is doing to the church. The point is not whether Chrestus refers to Christ. The point is the expelling from Rome of the Jews for not living peacefully within the Roman Empire. The message was patently clear to the Jewish people. Act within the boundaries of behavior acceptable to Rome, or you will forfeit your homes and your livelihood. In the section below, on the relationship of the synagogue and the church, we will see how the policies of Rome toward the Jews directly shaped the Jewish policies towards Jewish and then Gentile Christians. Included in the permission to keep their ancient customs was the Jewish right to level their temple tax and send this money to Jerusalem. We're still at 41 AD. But the religious freedom of the Jews was now contingent upon not showing contempt of the superstitious observances of other nations, but to keep their own laws only. Let's go on over to the heading, the synagogue and the church. Just flip on ahead, but what, a page or two?
Top of the next page.
Top of 81, is it? The synagogue and the church. The edict of Claudius, issued in 41 AD, forbade Jews from in any way denigrating the religious beliefs and practices of non-Jews under the threat of serious consequences if they did not obey. The edict by Claudius permitted religious freedom to the Jews, provided they did not show contempt of the superstitious observances of other nations, but to keep their own laws only. The Roman Empire was polytheistic, had many gods, deities in it. There were many gods to choose from, and one worshiped the imperial cult plus any other deities one fancied. God-fearers were attracted to the Jewish faith. This would have been Gentiles that liked the simplicity of the Jewish faith and its moral code. But most of the God-fearers, they could attend the synagogue and sit at the back, remain polytheistic. For them, the Jewish God was not the only God the God-fearers worshiped exclusively, nor did the synagogue officially encourage God-fearers to denounce all the other gods and adopt the monotheistic worship. The Jews said, you can come, you can sit at the back, we're not encouraging you to do anything, but you're welcome to sit at the back. Christian Jews, on the other hand, openly and aggressively advocated the worship of only one God, the Jewish God, who had in these last days revealed himself in the person of Jesus, who was crucified and resurrected. The larger Jewish population had yet to decide its position regarding the church and Christian Judaism. But the larger Jewish population saw the evangelistic proselytizing efforts of the Christian Jews among God-fearers and Gentiles in general as reckless and dangerous. Claudius had pointedly forbidden any and all proselytizing efforts by Jews. Such efforts by Christian Jews placed the larger Jewish population at risk of punishment by the Romans. From the point of view of Judaism, the church must obey the edict of Claudius, or all Jews would suffer the consequences. The Jews therefore put pressure on the church to cease and desist in its evangelistic efforts among non-Jews. The Jews also sought to distance themselves from the church so they could declare to the Roman authorities, we aren't them. Hey, we don't know who that little group is, but they're not us. Don't punish us for them. They distance themselves. The synagogue is not the church, and the church is not a synagogue. If I come on down to 44 then, AD, in order to protect his Jewish people from Roman reprisals, King Herod Agrippa, who would have been a son, descendant of King Herod the Great, Herod Agrippa I, understanding the church to be a Jewish sect, increased the pressure on the church in Jerusalem to abide by the Roman law. He had James, the brother of John the Evangelist, executed and Peter thrown in prison. The Apostle John and the Theotokos fled Jerusalem to Ephesus and visited Ignatius in Antioch. They eventually will return to Jerusalem. In 46 AD, Paul and Barnabas brought relief funds from the church in Antioch to the church in Jerusalem. Paul and Barnabas returned to the church in Antioch. In 48 AD, Paul and Barnabas were ordained for the first evangelistic journey, first missionary journey. Paul and Barnabas returned from this journey to Antioch within the year. And during this evangelistic journey, Paul and Barnabas, clearly breaking the Claudian edict, spoke with Jews, God-fearers, and Gentiles about faith in Jesus Christ. By 49 AD, Jewish Christians from Judea arrived in Antioch, teaching the Gentile converts, hey, you guys have got to be circumcised. You've got to become Jews. Why? You see, all Jews, every Jewish male was already circumcised. Every Gentile male wasn't. We can't stop the church from evangelizing Gentiles, but if we can make every Gentile male have to be circumcised, I have a feeling they'll slow down their conversions. It was not a theological battle, it was existential. Okay. In such a way, the church would remain inside Judaism if it stopped this nonsense, and the threat of the evangelism of the church created the threat that it caused to the synagogue would cease. Wow, that's our good stopping point tonight. You've survived. We had to lay a little bit of a foundation to get to that conclusion. We have to understand who the Jews are that Jesus is talking to, what they believed, what was there, and we cannot understand the Gospel of John, which is written in 90 AD, if we don't understand what has happened between Rome and the Jews in 41 AD, and the pressure that's putting on the church to stop evangelizing non-Jews, to change who we are. Is the church going to stop being the church? Is the synagogue, what's it going to do? It's in trouble with Rome. Is the church, or the synagogue going to protect us? Or is the synagogue going to get rid of us? All of that's in the Gospel of John. We're just setting the stage. So God bless you for your patience tonight. We've only got one more week of pain. I'll make it as painless as I can, and then we're going to start the Gospel of John, I think. So God bless you for coming. Thank you for being here. And remember, get your free entrance, one per family, right over here. And you can thank our Greek contingency for this. God bless you. Thank you.